What's cracking, everybody, and welcome in for the news dump of the last week for the Kraken. A lot of this happened about a week ago, but because of some recording limitations I had, as well as I'm trying to learn a new editing software to cut down on editing costs over the summer here and going on into the future of the channel, I wasn't able to get this out when a lot of this news actually came out a week ago, so you probably already know a lot of it. There's also the fact that I was kind of hoping if I waited just a couple extra days after it had gotten delayed a few days that maybe the Kraken would do the Beniers extension and I can include that in here, but it seems like they might just be waiting until I do this video to announce that extension. Not actually, but it'll probably just work out that way. Either way, here is the big Kraken news after the end of the free agency scramble when the Kraken made those last two big signings that we talked about a week ago. Clearly, the biggest part of that news, though, is the signing of the assistant coaches in Bob Woods, but especially Jessica Campbell, who will be largely in charge of the power play for the Kraken and also comes in as a big part of the development of some of those young players that are coming up with this coaching staff. Obviously, Dan Bielsma is the head coach, bringing up both of these assistant coaches who worked with him in Coachella Valley, but also coming up with guys like Shane Wright, Ty Cartier, who they were with in that first season, and a potential couple of others that might be following them close behind. Riker Evans, also coming up to the NHL this season, is another big part of that. And sure, there might be some risk for the Kraken in bringing up a coaching staff that, for the most part, is coming up from the AHL and either hasn't ever been in the NHL or hasn't been in the NHL for quite some time. At the same time, though, this is a coaching staff that is all staying for the most part together, a large chunk of them coming up all from the same team in the AHL, and a team that they helped take to the Calder Cup finals both of the last two seasons. And while they didn't win either of those cups, they did come just one goal away in the first season and just a game away here in this last one. So still a lot of success coming up from the next best level to the NHL, and they're all coming up as a group so they can keep some of that consistency and don't have to get to know a new group of coaches. Their different likes, dislikes, coaching styles, especially the coaching style of the head coach, who will largely be driving most of that. They're all coming up with a lot of familiarity of each other and how they work as a unit. With all that having been said, though, as I'm sure you're also well aware, the biggest part of this chunk of the news and what makes Jessica Campbell in particular especially notable in this whole offseason for the Kraken is that this move by her coming up to the NHL makes her the first female assistant coach that will be behind an NHL bench in the entire history of the league, as the Kraken as an organization continue to try to drag the NHL into the 21st century when it comes to representation of anybody that isn't a white male. Now, of course, news stories like this aren't particularly new to us here in Kraken land, as we saw just a couple seasons ago, the first ever all-black TV broadcast of an NHL game put on by Everett Fitzhugh as he moved over to take John Forsland's spot for a game alongside JT Brown. The Kraken front office has constantly been a standard bearer of the NHL when it comes to diversity, whether that's females or minorities stepping in for scouting roles, analytics roles in particular. And I mean, heck, it's probably never been more obvious than the event we just had over a week and a half ago with the NHL draft. And I don't know necessarily if you could tell this is easy on TV, but being there in person and being able to just look down at the draft floor at all the different front office tables that were down there making those picks, the Kraken were clearly one of the most diverse tables out there, and just when it comes to female representation, since that is kind of the focus when it comes to this discussion with Jessica Campbell coming up as the first behind-the-bench coach in the NHL, the Kraken were not just one of the only tables to have multiple females at that table, but one of the only ones to have a female at all. So, again, this is just another step for the Kraken in showing that they are the forefront or one of the teams helping drag the NHL, like I said, into the 21st century, and realize that there are a lot of other good hockey minds out there that can help organizations get better than just what we've had traditionally over the last 100 years of the NHL's existence. Of course, while this is a big step for Coach Campbell and the Kraken organization as a whole, and certainly the biggest one she's made yet, with really the last big step from a coaching perspective, moving into the head coaching role eventually, which if things go well with this assistant job, I'd have to imagine she probably would be in track then pretty easily to be the first NHL female head coach. That's still probably years down the road, but regardless of whether or not, or maybe when that eventually does happen for her down the road, as for right now, this is not even the first that she's had along the way to the NHL, as just a few years back, she was the first female assistant coach of a men's international team when she helped coach Team Germany, and then not long after became the first female assistant coach behind the bench of an AHL team in the inaugural season for the Firebirds, and of course, the rest we know of those first two seasons is history. Even with all that having been said, though, and this hopefully helping move the league forward into a better place in the future, there are still going to be those, and I'm sure there already have been some for lack of a better word or more family-friendly term, haters who are going to look at this and just see it as a PR move and a chance to, basically just get a good headline for a team that didn't have a great season. I mean, sure, maybe if a team was unapologetically all-out tanking, this is the type of move that might get boosted up a little bit for the sake of that PR, but the Kraken are absolutely not in that spot right now. They are very clearly trying to get back to the playoffs after a disappointing season last year. They made the moves they did with the coaching staff, firing the head coach, and also moving on with different reasons from some of the other coaches for that reason, as well as making two of the biggest signings, in fact, the two biggest signings in the history of their GM, clearly with the intent of moving this team forward and getting better into this next season. So there's absolutely no way that they would have made this higher if Campbell wasn't every bit qualified for it, and maybe even slightly overqualified for it, given that, again, she is the first and will have that extra scrutiny in this role. Now, aside from her qualifications, sure, a big part of the reason she got the job is because of the connections to already being an assistant with Bielsma at the AHL level, and to be honest, that's just how most people in NHL get their jobs, is who they know, almost as importantly as what they've done. Still, at the AHL level, she's done pretty well as an assistant coach, obviously taking the Firebirds to where they were. Now, the big part that she's going to be doing with the Kraken, or the more statistically visible part she's going to do with the Kraken, is helping run the power play, which for the Kraken has not been great the first 3 seasons. It's improved a bit over each of those 3 seasons. It was horrible the first season, one of the worst power plays in the NHL, and then below average the second season, and this last year did actually improve from that second season just a little bit, and they were pretty much smack dab in the middle of the league, right around the 20% that you're looking for at a bare minimum. Now, that being said, the Firebirds power play wasn't necessarily a world beater either. They ranked 14th in the AHL in both of the seasons, with Campbell as the lead of that power play unit. And there's gonna be some caveats around the fact that the Kraken just don't have a ton of offensive talent to be one of the best power plays in the league compared to teams like the Leafs with that offensive talent, or certainly the Oilers with McDavid and Draisaitl, at least for one more year anyway. Regardless, though, it certainly couldn't hurt and probably will help to have a new set of eyes on that Kraken power play to hopefully take that next step into maybe above average power play this next season. And it'll also certainly help to have Montour as that second or maybe even first power play quarterback. The combination of Dunn and Montour heading up the blue line for the Kraken on the power play certainly should help things along to maybe slightly above 20% on the power play, and maybe that even being a strength of the team offensively, which they could use any bit of offensive help that they could possibly get after last season. And then again, like I said before, the other advertised strength of her coaching style is the development side of things, where the Kraken could also certainly use some strong development in the coaching staff for the Matty Beniers and Shane Wrights of the world in particular, also Riker Evans, but especially Beniers and Wright, who they really need to, sooner rather than later, turn into those franchise cornerstone top 6 type of centers that they have the talent to be. And obviously, like I said, Riker Evans, Ty Cartier, and then plenty of the other prospects that seem like they're on their way up sooner rather than later through the juniors and AHL system. And of course, that familiarity she already has with some of those guys that have played for the Firebirds over the last couple of years, like Shane Wright and Riker Evans and Ty Cartier, for example, certainly only helps with that. With that, though, of course, as always with really any new hiring or signing, we're just going to have to wait and see how this pans out over the next season and on into the future. I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section about this hiring and what you felt when the Kraken made it. Obviously, the next step with Bielsa making the jump to the NHL was either that Campbell was likely to come with him or potentially be the first head coach at the AHL level, female head coach at the AHL level. So, yeah, obviously taking Bielsa's spot, we also learned that Lexstall takes the spot there. Not really someone I know that much about, but hopefully for the Firebirds, they can keep their winning ways going. Moving on for now, though, we do have a couple of other pieces of Kraken news to get to that happened in the same window of a couple of days right after that first day of free agency, one of which is another free agent signing for the Kraken and actually another defenseman from the Florida Panthers, this time in left shot defenseman Josh Mahura, who the Kraken get for the minimum just under $1 million, a 1-year deal. So Mahura, definitely a depth guy that ends up just filling that role, the void left by Dumoulin, who they traded to the Ducks to get the cap relief from that $3.5 million that Dumoulin was signed to. So the Kraken still end up netting just under $3 million in cap space, switching out Dumoulin for Mahura as they get him over from, like I said, the cup-winning Florida Panthers. He's a 26, so younger defenseman, 26-year-old defenseman who was drafted in the 3rd round of the 2016 entry draft by the Anaheim Ducks. before eventually moving over to the Florida Panthers for the last couple seasons, where he played still a third pairing role, but a fairly significant role for the Panthers in their Cup final appearance the year before, even playing a significant chunk of those playoff games. And then this last season was much more of the depth defense type of role that he'll be playing for the Kraken, getting into 30 games for the Panthers, where he only had 9 assists and no goals, and then didn't play any of the playoff games on their way to winning that Cup. So we'll see how things pan out for Mahura over this next season for the Kraken. Like I said, ideally, he doesn't play a huge role with the team, just that 7th defenseman that comes in for a few games here and there. Probably not too much more than the 30 games he played with Florida. That having been said, things have to go ideally for that to be the case, and more likely than not, there will be an injury along the way, or potentially if one of the guys just isn't playing very well, if somehow Riker Evans takes a step back in the offseason and just doesn't really look ready for that full NHL role, then Mahura would step in there. So if for whatever reason he does end up playing a significant number of games, there's always the chance that he could earn himself a future contract with the Kraken if he plays well in that time. There's also the potential chance, and this is kind of where I thought the Kraken were going after the Dumoulin trade, of Cale Fleury being ready for more NHL action as that depth defenseman. And I think he'll still probably have that chance in camp to earn his way to that depth defense role. Obviously, the Kraken really not taking much of a risk with the Mahura contract. It's the smallest one they could realistically sign him to. So if Fleury looks like he is ready for more of an NHL role, again, probably not taking one of the top 6 spots, but with injuries, you never really know, then that's still certainly a possibility. Plus, I suppose Mahura adds another name to that list of Kraken players who already have Stanley Cup winning experiences. I'm pretty sure I saw that they have now at least one member of the last 9 Stanley Cup winning teams. So yeah, it's certainly something they seem to value as an organization, having experience with the highest level of success at the NHL level. And they certainly do have a lot of cups in the room, even including the coaching staff, with Bylsma having won that first cup in his first year as a coach with the Penguins. And then finally, with the last piece of Kraken news, at least for this news dump anyway, which was actually broken by Ron Francis before the first day of the Kraken dev camp, right after he got Catton signed to his entry-level deal. Francis, before leaving the ice, announced to the crowd to a large cheer that they had re-signed Eeli Tolvanen to a 2-year, $3.475 million deal. Actually, the term and amount he didn't announce on the ice. We found that out later, but the Kraken do re-sign Tolvanen for 2 more seasons to a pretty reasonable deal for a guy that's likely to play more of a second, well, could end up on the third line, probably spends most of his time on the third line, especially with the improvements that he made in his defensive game last season. Still, with that shot, you'd have to imagine the Kraken are going to find in Jessica Campbell, try to find a way to get his shot a little bit more involved on the power play, certainly than it was last season. So yeah, it's a pretty good deal for the Kraken, especially considering some of the other contracts that we saw getting signed across the league for players that fit a similar type of role to what Tolvanen does for the Kraken. Obviously, there's the questions around the 2 contracts the Kraken did sign, especially the Stevenson one on the forward end. Tolvanen, though, isn't going to fit nearly the same role that Stevenson would, so it's not like that's really an interchangeable type of situation, but still under $4 million for a player, under $3.5 million for a player like Tolvanen that has scoring upside, can play a role on the power play, and also has proven that he's a pretty decent defensive player that can fit a good third line type of role. I think it's a great signing for the Kraken to get 2 more years of value out of that waiver claim from the Predators a couple seasons ago. With that, though, and given that there is still no news on Beniers' new contract, I'll leave it to you down in the comment section what you think of this batch of Kraken news, this probably last big news dump of the offseason, what you're planning to do with yourself over the next 2 months while we wait for Kraken hockey to really get started again in the end of September, and then obviously the season starting in October. Maybe we'll have a look at the Kraken schedule and go over that at some point here in the near future. That did also come out recently, but I've got a couple 101s in the works, one of which is actually almost done editing, so there'll still be plenty of videos on this channel. I've got a couple of ideas of other things to do in August outside of the 101s. Obviously, the last history video, as frequently requested, will happen at some time here in the next little while before the Kraken gets started. But let me know your thoughts down in the comment section, and otherwise, until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken.